Today's daf is daf Kuf Tes, and we'll begin with Tanya, which is 4 lines down from the top of the Om. We have a brisa. Omar Lov al Rabbi Akiva, Miyomav lo Omar. He never told the people in the Beis Medrash, Higia Eis Lamod. Now it's time to close the Beis Medrash. Let's go back home. Or let's go to wherever we have to go. In other words, we could always learn Torah in the Beis Medrash any day of the year. It doesn't matter when. Chutz me Arvei Pesachim the Erev Yom Kippur. There are 2 days out of the entire calendar year when Rabbi Akiva would tell them, go, leave the Beis Medrash. And they both happen to be Erev Yontif. In one case, it's Erev Pesach, and in the other, it's Erev Yom Kippur. And here he would make the declaration, Higia Eis Lamod, it's time to leave the Beis Medrash. He would, so to speak, throw the people out of the Beis Medrash. In the case of Arvei Pesachim, Bishvil, he wanted to make sure that the mature adults parents would oversee their children, and the Tinokos, Bishvil Atinokos she Kedei Shelo Yishnu, in other words, that they should oversee that their children get some sleep on Erev Pesach, so they'll be up for the Seder. They won't be tired during the Seder, and they'll participate in the Seder. The Torah says, we got it to Bincha, and we want them to ask the questions, the Manishtana. U'be'erev Yom Kippurim, Kedei she'achilu es b'neihem. On Erev Yom Kippur, the Gemara derives in the Masechet Brachos a mitzvah of achila and chesiyah, because the pasuk says, b'yom hatshi, and the Gemara establishes that kol ha'ochel v'shotze be'erev Yom Kippur malal v'kosav kilu is ane tshi ve'asiri. So Erev Yom Kippur is a separate day with a mitzvah achila, very, very unique day. And to make sure that the family is eating properly and drinking properly, fulfilling this mitzvah, the parent, the father in this case, would have to go home, leave the Beis Medrash, and supervise and make sure this is done. We learned in the Brayso, Chayav Adam l'sameach banav u'bnei beiso b'regel. In other words, it's not enough that I personally am chayav and obligated in simchas haregel, but I also have to make sure that my children, my household, are b'simcha. Shenemar v'samachta b'chagecha ato uvincha uvitecha. So it means ato uvincha uvitecha. Your responsibility is to make sure that your children are in a state of simcha. That's your chiyuv on Yontif. And Steve Ramaskel Shenemar has a slightly different girsa. It says v'samachta Ata ubeisecha, which is a pasuk in Parshas Re'eh in the context of Meiser Sheni, and it indicates quite clearly that you have to be misameach your children. And then the Brisa asks, "Bameh misamacham." What is the way in which you can be misameach your family? Now, during the time that the Beis Hamikdash stood, we have a principle called Ein Simcha El B'Basar. And if you take a look at Tosas, Divin HaMaskal Bameh, he points out that our Gemara is asking the question, B'Tzman Hazeh, we don't have the Migdash, we're not eating the basar or the kachnim, so what substitute do we have for the mitzvah of Simcha, substitute for basar? And in Meiser Sheni, the Torah says, "Babakar ubatzon bayayin ub'shechar," and that teaches me babakar batzon bizman shebeis hamikdash kayam, to eat from the karbonos. However, bizman hazeh, that's the end of this pasuk, u'biyayin ub'shechar. So that's what the Gemara says. The Brisa says, "B'meh misamcham biyayin." Rabbi Yehuda Omer, he says, if you're looking for a simcha and a method of bringing joy to your family, it has to be something that's shava l'kulam, that anyone could appreciate and enjoy. And it could be very possible that anoshim, men would appreciate wine, but not necessarily the women folk and not the children. Therefore, Anoshim Beroy Lahem, whatever is appropriate for a man, like for example, Shtiyas Yayin or Achilas Basar, that's their way of Simcha. V'Noshim Beroy Lahem. So the Gemara wants to clarify, what does Rabbi Yehuda mean when he says Noshim Beroy Lahem and Anoshim Beroy Lahem? Anoshim Beroy Lahem B'Yayin. Noshim Beroy Lahem B'Mai. How is he Mesameach his wife? Tani Rabbi Yosef B'Bavel. In Bavel, the way they would Mesameach the Noshim is the big day Tzivonim. They would buy them colored clothing, beautiful clothing. Eretz Yisrael, the big day Pishtan Migo Hatzin. They would buy linen, very crispy linen garments that were ironed properly. And it would seem that in Bavel, there's no option here of Simcha B'Big Day Pishtan Migo Hatzin. And the reason for that, as we explained in Tosfos, is Mishum Shalayu B'Kiyah B'Gihutz, that in Bavel, they didn't have the expertise of Gihutz, and apparently in order to be Magayitz linen clothing, you need a very special umnus, like a special kind of a proficiency. They didn't have that expertise in Bavel, hence the method would be B'Knias Big Day Tzivon. We see here from this Gemara, this Brisa, that the kiyum of mitzvah simcha is kol echad karoilo. The simcha is not inherent in the maisa, in the action per se. Any action will do as long as it brings to the result of a state of simcha. Tanya, we learned in a Brisa of Yudim and B'Seira Omer, Bizman Shebeis Hamikdash Kayam, Ein Simcha El B'Basar. When the Mikdash stood, the mitzvah of simcha was very specific, and it would express itself in the eating of basar shlomim. Shenemar, v'zavachta shlomim v'achalta sham v'samachta l'fnei Hashem Elokecha. The Torah commands us to bring the carbon shlomim and to eat the carbon shlomim l'fnei Hashem Elokecha. And that's v'samachta, that's the kiyum of simcha, eating from the basar shlamim lifnei Hashem Elokecha. V'achshav shein beis hamikdash kayim ein simcha el b'yayin. We only have simcha with drinking wine. Shenemar pasuk in Tilim v'yayin yisamach lev levav enosh. Now, at this point, the Gemara goes into a long discussion about the shear of revius, which is absolutely necessary for the 4 cups of wine. How do we go about measuring a revius? And the Gemara is also going to address the question, how do we arrive at this shear of revius? Amar Rav Yitzchak, Kista de Muryasa, Dahavi b'Tzipori. In the city of Tzipori, they used a certain kli, a certain utensil. And who would use this utensil? It was earmarked for the mochrim, for the sellers, in order to do what's called midida, to measure it out so that they could tell the lokeach, the buyer, that he's getting exactly what he's paying for, this exact measure. And the word mursyasa refers to shemen dagim. And this oil of fish oil, was measured out in a kli which is called kista. And that's the kli that they used in Tzipori. They knew one thing about the measurement of this particular kli, of this receptacle called a kista, that it could hold exactly the volume of the lug in the Beis Hamikdash. And therefore, uba mishayim revius. Revius meaning revius yayin l'dalit kosos shel leil hapesach. So what they would do is they would fill up the kista. They knew that would be the equivalent of an entire lug. And then they would divvy up the contents into another 3 kalim. So they had 4 kalim, each of which had in it a quarter of a lug, a revius lug, and that's the shear that's necessary for daled kosos. So this is Rabbi Yitzchak's recommendation as to how we can determine and measure a revius lug for the shear, the minimum shear for the daled kosos of yain. On Rabbi Yochanan offers an alternative method by which we could measure out exactly a revius lug, and he tells us that timenaisa. Now, the word timenaisa is an Aramaic form of the word tomen, and that's what the Rashbam points out is a midah called tomen. And it's mentioned in the Gemara in Sota on Daf Chesamid Beis, together with another measurement which is called Uchla. Tosfos Dibra Maschil Timnasa quotes the Rashbam, that's a reference to Tomen, and he rejects it based on a Gemara in Baba Basra, because the Gemara seems to give another measurement to the to the Tomen. It's lug urevius halug. It's more than a revius lug. In any event, let's go with the Rashbam. And when was this tomen used, in what context and in what location in the world as a measurement? It was kadmaisa dahavi b'Tveria. It was in the earlier time of Tveria. He doesn't tell you exactly what period of time, but some earlier time, says Rabbi Yochanan in Tveria. They knew that this tomen, havi yisera alda, that original tomen, back in the day in the city of Tveria, had more than riva. It had an excess beyond revius haluk. Uba mishayirim revius shel Pesach. And that means the following, that the discrepancy, the increment between the old tomen and the tomen of our days, in other words, the tomen at the time of Tveria would hold a revius lug more than our tomen. The discrepancy between our tomen, which is a smaller measurement, and the original tomen keduma of Tveria is revius halug. And therefore, all you have to do is fill up a tomen keduma, and I'm assuming now that they had access to a tomen keduma. And once you filled it up to the top, you would pour it into our tomen of today, which is a smaller measurement of by a revius halug. And what you're left with in the tomen keduma is a revius halug. So that's how you could measure a revius halug. Amar Rav Chizda wants to say that this shear of a revius is in the Torah itself. Revius shel Torah, the shear of a midah of the Torah. Now, when he says that there's a revius shel Torah, he's not talking about the shear of revius relative to daled kosos, because we know that daled kosos is only the rabbanon. So what's he referring to when he says revius shel Torah? So kigon, we have a number of examples of this. Revius yayin shel nazir, which is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai, and that's explained by the Gemara in Sukkah Navav. Then we have revius dam haba mishnei mesiv, which means that revius hadam of either one or two corpses is metami bi'oel, and that's based on a pasuk in Vayikra Chaf Aleph, where it says, "Al kol nefashos meis lo yavo." And that's a sugya nazir daf lamed ches. And then we have a reviat shemen l'rikike nazir according to Rabbi Akiva menachos peites, and it's derived from psukim. So we have a number of examples, 3 precedents of a reviat shel Torah. We have the yayin of nazir. We have the dam of a corpse, of a tumas oil, and then we have the shemen for rikike nazir. Now, what is the measurement, or how do we calculate the measurement of reviat shel Torah? So he says, etzba'ayim al etzba'ayim berum etzba'ayim v'chetzi etzba v'chomesh etzba. So we're talking about a kli, a receptacle, and we're talking about the airspace, the empty space within the kli. So we're talking about the maximum volume that this kli, whatever it might be, could hold on to. Now, what are the measurement of this kli, the space, the vacant space within it that would hold a revius? And the measurements of this kli are 2 etzbos. That's called the orech, and 2 etzbos in the rochav, in the width. So basically you have somewhat of a square, and the height is 2 etzbos and a half and another 1/5. And Rav Chizda is going to now proceed to prove his point. Kidisanya, as we learned in the Brisa. And this Brisa is referring to a tvila, the tvila in the mikvah of a tameh, and is darshaning the pasuk in Vayikra Tesvav, v'rachatz b'mayim es kol b'saro, which means we're going to derive a number of different halachas from this pasuk, from a careful reading of this pasuk, v'rachatz b'mayim es kol b'saro. Number 1, shelo yehei davar chotzeitz bein b'saro lamayim, that there should not be anything that is chotzeitz, that separates his basar from direct contact with the water. And in Bava Kama, they derive this from the pasuk v'rachatz es b'saro b'mayim, and Rashi says b'saro b'mayim. This is Rashi in Bava Kama. Mashma sheyiga b'saro b'mayim. So b'saro b'mayim means in that pasuk v'rachatz b'saro b'mayim. That's not the same pasuk that we have here in our brisa, but b'mayim means shehei b'sar nogea b'mayim. Now, we go on to derive another halacha from this pasuk in a careful reading. It doesn't say b'mayim, but rather it says b'mayim. And once again, it would seem that the Brisa is quoting this pasuk in Vayikra Tesvav, where it says v'rachatz b'mayim. It says not. It doesn't say b'mayim, but b'mayim. What is the emphasis here? What do we derive from b'mayim? B'mei mikvah. In other words, the Torah is specifying a specific mayim, b'mayim, that known mayim, which is on in a special category, and that's called mei mikvah. Mei mikvah means water that's naturally collected from the rains that fall, as opposed to water that's collected in a kli, which is called mayim she'uvim. So he's not going to be mitayr himself by entering into mayim she'uvim that are drawn from a kli, but rather mei mikvah. Mikvah means gathered water in its own natural state from the water that falls down from Shamayim. Now, Another diuk in the pasuk is it doesn't say v'rachatz b'saro v'rachatz b'mayim es b'saro, but rather it says es kol b'saro, meaning mayim shekol gufo ola b'hen. That the Torah is telling you something about this mayim. It's got to be mayim of kol b'saro. Kol b'saro means kol gufo, and the water has to be the volume of which you would be covering your entire body in one moment, bivas achas. By submerging your body into the water, there's enough water to cover your body. Now, l'chor, you would say, well, it depends on the size of the body. No two people are exactly the same size. So the Brisa asks for kamahen. What's the shear? How much of a midah of mayim is considered enough that kol gufo, his entire body is ola, meaning muskasa, is covered by this water?